مين حمدا شاكرين والسلام على سيد المرسلين نبينا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم تسليما كثيرا. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. I feel a great honor being in the company of such esteemed people as yourselves and in this great house of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and I ask Allah to increase all of you in great barakah and great blessings, and for this masjid also. I also feel a great sense of honor in being able to speak a little about an individual who we all know a little about. One of the statements of, I think, Imam al-Subki, who said that man arrakha musliman faka'annama ahyahu, whoever relates the tale or relates the life of a Muslim, it's as if he's given him life. And this individual is somebody who, since the assassination of our brother Malcolm X, Al-Hajj al-Shabazz, February 22nd, 1965, perhaps there have been hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of people who have been inspired to embrace Islam because of his legacy or his story, or who have had their faith solidified because of his struggle and his legacy. Malcolm X. I think all of us feel a sense of being captivated by the legacy of that individual, Malcolm X. No human being, however, is to be understood, in a simplistic sense. Every human being is complicated because there's so many different dynamics and dimensions that make a person who that person ends up becoming. No human being becomes who they are at the end of the day, except there's a string of factors and different influences and influences in their lives. Malcolm X was born Malcolm Little in 1925 in Omaha. And some of the most important things for us to remember in his early life is the fact that Malcolm X was black. He was an African American. So when we speak about Malcolm X, we're speaking about somebody who was really living in a time of entrenched racism. And what does that mean? Sometimes it's hard for us, any of us, to really get to grips with, understand, because we're not living in that context, in that country, in that time, in that society. What would it have meant for a black person living in America in that time where you had the Jim Crow laws? What would it have meant in that time where you lived under segregation? So, bathrooms for whites and bathrooms for blacks. So what would it have meant in that time where you have, cinemas where whites have particular seats and the blacks have other seats at the back? What would it mean if you're living in a time of lynching of black people? What does it mean? Malcolm X, when he was 6 years old, his father, who was a priest, but he was someone who was inspired, influenced by the work of Marcus Garvey. Marcus Garvey was quite an amazing individual in his own way because he championed the idea of black self-determination. In fact, many of the later ideas of, like the Nation of Islam, Elijah Muhammad, in fact, were influenced by the work of Marcus Garvey. His father was a great follower, admirer of Marcus Garvey. And he was also a wealthy individual. And so when he chose to live in an area of white people, the white people in that area forced him out. They began to, put pressure on him to move from where he's living, to go and live in a black district. And Malcolm X's father, he said that, but I've earned my way here. I've earned my life to live here. And then they firebombed his home. They burnt his home. Malcolm X was only 6 years old, Malcolm Little at that time, of course, when they tied his father up and then they ran over him. And his father was killed when he was 6 years old. His uncle, in fact, was lynched. What does lynching mean? Before, in the later part of the 19th century, lynching was a discreet. It was an act that was done by mobs. When they would take black people, sometimes from prisons, from cells, from their homes, and they would take them. Sometimes they were discreet. At the back of the shed or at the back of the garden or end of the orchard. And they would hang them up and kill them like that. But with the rise of cinematography and the rise of the big screen, neon lights, America's undergoing all of that, it becomes more of a public spectacle. So lynching became public events. Will Mack, who was lynched, I think in 1955 or 56, there was a crowd of 1,500 people that came to see his lynching, right? So you had people who were buying popcorn and soda pop and take artifacts of his clothes, and it was seen as a public spectacle to see a black man being lynched. And then, of course, you had the rise of photography and cinematography, and so lynchings became, you had photographers who were present at the lynching, pre-lynching photographs, post-lynching photographs. Then you had lynching together with burning alive, lynching and then burning alive. And this is horrendous. And so a lot of black people suffered because of this. Malcolm X's uncle was lynched after his father was murdered. So imagine a child, living with that sense of trauma. Whole idea is that a person who feels unsafe, unprotected in that environment, knowing that that person is undermined, devalued, dehumanized, otherized, is a person who the whole sense of belonging in your world, in your existential existence is questioned. And so Malcolm X then, with his and then his mother has a nervous breakdown, and so she's sent off to a mental asylum. And so Malcolm X and his siblings are separated into different foster homes. And so when he's separated, he goes to school, and the interesting thing is that in his school, it's an all-white school, and he's the only black child in that school. But he's very, very good in academic studies. He's very clever. A key moment that happens in his life is that once Malcolm X was in his class, and his teacher asked students, "What do you want to be when you grow up?" And so Malcolm Little, this young boy, says, "When I grow up, I want to be a lawyer. My aspiration is to be a lawyer." And so his teacher said, "But that is not a reasonable, occupation for using the N-word, for an N-word like you. Of course, this is disparaging, this is belittling, condescending, this is discriminatory." And then he says in his autobiography that I lost all hope. I lost hope in the education system. If the teacher's even saying that to you, and teacher then says it's more likely you should become a carpenter rather than having an expectation or a dream to become a lawyer. Malcolm X then never goes back to school. And it's interesting because he writes in his autobiography that he said, "Gentlemen, I finished 8th grade in Michigan, and then I attended junior high school in the black ghettos of Massachusetts, and then he says I attended college in the streets of Harlem, and I received my master's in prison." And that's really what made Malcolm X. What made Malcolm X is his life in prison. Malcolm X said that there's nobody, I think, who has learned and benefited more from being in prison than me. And then he also said that I see every situation in life, every calamity as a learning point. I see every tribulation as a point of edification, as a point of learning, as a transitionary process by which you're able to excel in so many different ways. It's very in line with the Islamic thinking. And so Malcolm X, therefore, when he is out of school and he goes to live with his sister in Detroit, and he takes to a life of crime. He's very impressionable, takes to a life of crime. He becomes a street peddler, he becomes a gangster, becomes a drug dealer, drug addict, criminal, thug, pimp, all of these things. And he's kind of known as the Detroit Red. That was his name that was given to him. And he's committing crime, burglaries and crimes, and he's arrested on 3 occasions. It was on the 3rd occasion when he was sentenced to 8 years in prison. He spent 6 years in prison from 1946 to 1952. So 1946 goes to prison, and then he has this really interesting time in prison. For him, in his autobiography, in his own words, he said that was the beginning point of his transformation. And therefore, if you think about any human being, whether it's Malcolm X or anybody else, everyone goes through a transformation in life, and there's different factors that make that transformation real for a person. Sometimes it's trauma. If you're a child and you see your father being killed and you're living in that situation, that's traumatic, Sometimes it's death, being exposed to a person dying and seeing the ephemeral and transitory nature of life. It has a big impact on you. Sometimes it's illness, sometimes it's loss, sometimes it's, all of these things have affect the people in different ways. Malcolm X, when he goes to prison, I still call Malcolm Little, he makes mention of an individual called Bambi. And he said that when I noticed that in prison, there's different sectors of prison, there's different kind of groupings in prison, but I saw that the person who had commanded the most respect in prison was a person who was clever, was a person who was intelligent, who was literate, who was educated, who was articulate. Calls him, I'll read a section now from autobiography called Bambi. And so he really acclaims this individual, and this becomes for him one of the key moments of change in his life. He says that, in his section on Bambi, he said that, where are we? Bimbi seldom said much to me. He was gruff to individuals, but I sensed he liked me. What made me seek his friendship was when I heard him discuss religion. I considered myself beyond atheism. I was Satan. But Bimbi put the atheist philosophy in a framework, so to speak, that ended my vicious cursing attacks. My approach sounded so weak alongside his, and he never used a foul word. Out of the blue one day, Bimbi told me flatly, as he was away, as was his way, that I had some brains if I'd use them. I had wanted his friendship, not that kind of advice. I might have cursed another convict, but nobody cursed Bimbi. He told me I should take advantage of the prison correspondence courses and the library. And this therefore motivates him to seek an education. Malcolm X had no education. In fact, later in his life, he said that when they hear him become such a profound orator, public speaker, debating in even Oxford Union in English, in England, in community centres, in churches, and in different places, you become such an amazing orator, public speaker. He said people, when they hear me, they probably think that I have such a long list of credentials of my education. But he said, I have nothing after my 8th grade in school. But the only place I learned was in the prison, in the library. And he takes, therefore, to reading. Malcolm X knew grammar slightly from his schooling days, but he had to learn, re-educate himself. How important is it for us as Muslims to learn, to read, to understand? These are things that Allah in the Quran emphasizes so many times. قُلْ هَلْ يَسْتَوِي الَّذِينَ يَعْلَمُونَ وَالَّذِينَ لَا يَعْلَمُونَ. Allah says, say, are those equal, those who know and those who don't know? With learning, of course, comes self-realization, comes self-discovery, self-exploration, comes a person's ability to connect with his Lord because he knows his Lord. فَعْلَمْ أَنَّهُ لَا إِلَهَ إِلَّا اللَّهِ. Allah says, فَعْلَمْ, know, have knowledge there's no ilah except Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And how many times the Prophet emphasized, مَنْ سَلَكَ طَرِيقًا يَلْتَمِسُ فِيهِ عِلْمًا. Whoever seeks a road in search of knowledge, Allah makes easy for him the road to heaven, to Jannah. مَنْ خَرَجَ فِي طَالِبِ الْعِلْمِ. Whoever comes out in search of knowledge, Allah, he's in the sabil of Allah, in the way of Allah until he returns to learn, to understand things, right? Not always to become a passive recipient where you're taking in everything from, like our crisis today because of the rise of social media and the visual media, where everyone is captivated by the flurry of thousands of screenshots passing through, our brains so quickly. But to be patient with literacy, to be patient with the book. Malcolm X, he didn't have much of a vocabulary, so he had to learn the dictionary. In fact, he wrote out the entire dictionary entirely by himself, just to accommodate himself, to become familiar with words. And I'll read that small section for you where he describes that. He says that, here we are. So he says that, as you can imagine, especially in a prison where there was heavy emphasis on rehabilitation, an inmate was smiled upon if he demonstrated an unusually intense interest in books. There was a sizable number of well-read inmates, especially the popular debaters. Some were said by many to be practically walking encyclopedias. they were almost celebrities. No university would ask any student to devour literature as I did when this new world opened to me of being able to read and understand. Because when you read, you impute yourself. I mean, you transition, you enter into somebody else. It's a very good book called A is for Ox by a man called Barry Sanders. A is for Ox because he's American, so they say A is for Ox. But the whole book is about literacy and gang culture. And so he speaks about gangsters in 1990s America, like in LA. And he says that there are so many, connections between the failure of literacy for people in urban environments or even in ghettoized environments where there's kind of like economic apartheid still existing or segregation. And those individuals who don't have access to literacy, don't have access to books, because it's a rise of gang culture lifestyle, of drugs. And he says, so for example, if you go to one of the homes of the gangsters in America, speaking about LA, he says it's very rare you would find a book, but you'd find, a satellite TV, cable TV, drugs, sometimes little food because they're dependent on drugs mostly. And then he asked this question, what would happen if you created a situation where you would facilitate for this individual to be able to read the autobiography of somebody? And he's asking these questions, and he's saying, for example, that if that happened, what would happen is that individual who's lived a life of how would you say it? He says, for example, he has transcripts of gangsters when they get caught after murdering people, and he says they never use words like murder or words like kill. They use words like terminate, exterminate, annihilate, obliterate, because they live in a Terminator kind of world. Everything is sudden, everything is quick. And he says the most popular gun for gangsters in 1990s LA was a gun called the Cobra M11. And he said that was a preferred choice for gangsters because it could fire like 1,000 rounds per minute, something like that. And he said, why was that such a preferred weapon? Because if the gangster goes to the restaurant to make a hit on the other rival gangster, he wants to exhibit a sense of utter complete destruction, just like when you play on a computer video game. It's about the more you destroy, the more fire, the more explosive goes off, the higher marks you're going to get, higher points you're going to get in your video game. And he said that's the kind of world that they live in. But he said if ever you take that person and you put him in a room and you make him read the autobiography of any human being, he'd learn once in his life that human being that I'm pointing my gun towards, the barrel, is not pointed towards a thing, an object, an entity that is lifeless, that's simply only a shell, but that there is a complexity in that person's being. And that's the whole thing, that we are not simply shells, bodies, we are mind, we are heart, we are nafs, spirit, ruh, we are jasad, we are qalb, we're all of these things put together. Therefore we have feelings. Malcolm X would ask the same thing to white people, right, the racists in his time, that the same tears that you shed are the tears that we shed, the same blood that you bleed, we also bleed, right? These are called human codes of familiarity. And so what would happen, therefore, with literacy and learning and reading is that you're at once engaged, immersed in the life experience of another human being just like you. And you would learn, therefore, that I'm pointing my barrel at somebody who has a mother just like I have a mother, and she would weep like my mother would weep. And she would feel pain as my mother would feel pain, and their siblings, and I have siblings, and all of these dynamics come, meaning there's a complexity of life and being in that experience. And so what he says is, I read more in my room than in the library itself. An inmate who was known to read a lot could check out more than the permitted maximum number of books. I preferred reading in the total isolation of my own room. When I had progressed to really serious reading, every night at about 10 p.m., I would be outraged with the lights out. It always seemed to catch me right in the middle of something engrossing. Fortunately, right outside my door was a corridor light that cast a glow into my room. The glow was enough to read by. once my eyes adjusted to it. So when the lights out came, I would sit on the floor where I could continue reading in that glow. At 1 hour intervals, the night guards paced past every room. Each time I heard the approaching footsteps, I jumped into bed and feigned asleep. As soon as the guards passed, I got out of my bed into the floor area of that light glow, where I would read for another 58 minutes until the guards approached again. That went on until 3 or 4 every morning. 3 or 4 hours of sleep a night was enough for me. Often in the years in the streets, I had slept less than that. So therefore, he is not, disallowing himself just because of his circumstance of being in prison to think, I'm in prison, and so what else would you do in prison except you're just waiting for your time to be released? He took advantage of opportunity of being in a circumstance he had no control over, because he's in prison. What else could you do? Right? So his active pursuit of learning through education was transformative for him, because that means when he comes out of prison, he's a new individual. And that's what knowledge does for us. That's what knowledge does, because it means that the more we learn, the more we acquire of knowledge, the more we're able to act upon our knowledge. Right? The Sahaba would say, تعلموا فإذا علمتم فأعملوا. Learn, and when you've learned, and act upon your knowledge with ilm and amal, with action and with knowledge and acting by that knowledge. Right? But of course, first you have to know, you have to learn. In his case, it was about learning about life, learning about history, learning about civilization, learning about black suffering. That was the key thing for him, right? And so what happens is that when he's learning, he's introduced, by somebody in the prison to a group called the Nation of Islam. Now, the Nation of Islam is only called the Nation of Islam, but it's nothing that we could say is Islamic about that organization, except it has the name Islam in it. The one that they followed was a man called Elijah Poole, who became Elijah Muhammad, and he claimed to be a prophet of Allah. وَنَعُوذُ بِاللَّهِ مِنْ ذَلِكَ. Of course, our Prophet said, أَنَا خَاتَمُ الْأَنْبِيَاءِ وَالْمُرْسَلِينَ وَلَا نَبِيَّ بَعْدِي. I am the seal of all the prophets, there is no prophet after me. And that is our belief, and that is the correct belief. There's no prophet after the Prophet of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. But in any case, he claimed to be a prophet, and a prophet to the black men, and then he introduced unto them a series of theological beliefs that are very at odds, with Islam. But what made his call so motivational for black people in that circumstance, in that time, in that situation, facing police brutality, facing white racism, is the fact that he gave them a sense of, hope through self-liberation and self-determination, by teaching them that there's no need for us to fear the white man, because the black man is in fact superior over the white man. The white man, he says, in fact is a devil who was created a long time ago by a scientist, called Dr. Yaqub. And it was like, the black man is supposed to have, a dominance, supremacy, superiority over the white man. The white man is just sowing corruption and evil on the earth, and nothing is good about the white man. And so the blacks, who are of course victims of all of this, racism and abuse and mistreatment and murder and lynching, they began to believe that. But the numbers of Nation of Islam were not many. They only had 500 people. By the time Malcolm X joins the Nation of Islam, the numbers was about 500 people. And so when he then decides to join the Nation of Islam, which was in prison, he wants to use his knowledge. So he wants to use all of the fact that he's learning about all of these things, and he's learning now how to write as well, to put it to good use. He begins to write letters to people, different people, friends, old gangsters he used to hang around with before in the streets. And he wants to now write a letter to who he calls Mr. Muhammad, i.e. Elijah Muhammad. And he realizes that his letters don't make very good sense, because he hasn't learned very much. And that therefore motivates him even more to begin to learn more, and to learn how to read, and to learn how to write, only for the purpose of correspondence. So you could correspond with the man he's now going to love so much, which is Elijah Muhammad, And then so Malcolm X, therefore, in his time in prison, the most transformative moment came through his being engrossed with literacy and learning, and reading and then writing. And so when he comes out of prison, he goes to visit Elijah Muhammad and officially becomes a member of the Nation of Islam. Malcolm becomes Malcolm X. So the reason why he gives himself the name X is because and he would himself explain and say that we came as slaves. And so remember, of course, the most obvious context for why the blacks were in that situation in America is because they were descendants of slaves. The Americans in the transatlantic and the Europeans in the transatlantic slave trade, traveled, took their ships, from across the Atlantic, went to Senegambia, West Africa, and by the way, almost 1/3 of them were Muslims. And they transported them on boats. Against, of course, their will. Many chose to commit suicide by jumping overboard. Many chose the path of insurrection. There's a very interesting book called Slave Insurrections, and some of the insurrections in fact happened on the ships where they fought back against, the captains of the ships. But in any case, when they arrived into the Americas, they were sold as slaves, and treated as slaves, as dehumanized, as subhuman entities. In the slave auctions, the mother would be separated from the child from the father, child from the mother, siblings. There's no sense of togetherness or unity in them. All right, so and they're not allowed to keep their real names, their surnames. They're given the surnames of the slave master. So if the slave master is called, Howard, then the boy would be called something, Howard. And that means they have no sense of identity, because we learn personalization, identification through naming. It's a very key thing, even in the Quran. It's so beautiful. In Surah Yusuf, for example, when the brothers are planning the murder, in fact, of Yusuf, because they said, قالوا اقتلوا يوسف أو اطرحوه أرضا يخل لكم وجه أبيكم. They said, kill Yusuf, or expel him, somewhere else in the land, and then your father's pleasure would turn towards you, because they were motivated, fueled by this sense of very deeply entrenched envy, for their brother. Then they said, we'll be pious after that. Then the one who had some conscientious objection in him, the older brother, said, قال قائل منهم لا تقتلوا يوسف. Allah says, and one of them said, don't kill Yusuf. It's very interesting, in fact, in these ayat, in Surah Yusuf, the way that the name Yusuf is used, because they could have used the dhamir, the pronoun, by saying لا تقتلوه, don't kill him. But the brother is saying, don't kill Yusuf. Some Mufassirin, they say this is to emphasize there's still family. There's still relations. And so he felt within himself, he's still actually my brother. In fact, they're all half brothers except Benjamin. They're all real brother. He's real brother, but the others are all half brothers. But the point is, the name is very key, right? Allah, the names are given by, there's a whole tradition behind naming. There's grandparents, there's societal, there's a network of family, tribal connections that are all involved in the giving of a name in different cultures. And so being stripped of your naming, being stripped of your identity, you have no personality. Who are you anymore, except you're only the slave, you're only the object, if you remember when you were in school, you might have read the book by John Steinbeck called Of Mice and, who remembers reading Of Mice and Men? All of you. So do you remember that there's some character like Curly's wife has no name because she's a woman. But Crooks is a black man. And Crooks has no name because he's called Crooks because his back is crooked. Right? So he has no sense of identification. We don't know who exactly he is because he's just called Crooks. Right? And so he gives himself therefore the name X, as in X represents the unknown. Because we don't know what the names of our forefathers are, my parents, their parents, X represents the unknown. Malcolm Little becomes Malcolm X. And then in the Nation of Islam, he becomes the minister of the main mosque in Harlem, for a long time. And what he does in Harlem and outside of Harlem is he establishes different, what they call temples or mosques or temples. the numbers of the Nation of Islam begin to grow rapidly. If there were 500 people by the time he joined that movement, by 1960s there was 75,000 people in the Nation of Islam. He sets up a separate military wing called the Fruits of Islam, FOI, to teach self-defense classes, so that people are like a vanguard of resistance against white brutality. That was Malcolm X's idea. He sets up a newspaper called Muhammad Speaks, which is now called The Final Call. But the newspaper idea was his idea, and he sets up the newspaper in his time, Muhammad Speaks, distributing ideas of the Nation of Islam. And it becomes very, very, paramount in his role as a leading spokesman. He becomes a media representative for the Nation of Islam. And he's traveling all around the country, debating other people, even other civil rights leaders, like Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King and others as well, who all proposed different solutions for dealing with white brutality against black people. But his was more in line with, he didn't say he proposed a solution of violence, but what he did say is that, we want peace with those who want peace with us, and we will be violent with those who are violent with us. He didn't propose violence as a first step, but he was simply saying that we refuse to turn the other cheek against those who make us the victims and who are violent against us, that there has to be a way for us to fight back against that, insulting treatment and degradation and abuse and murder and lynching and all of these things. And so it becomes controversial, particularly in American media, because he's taking the attitude, he's challenging the attitude of whiteness, which is built upon this idea of exceptionalism, of white supremacy. He's challenging that attitude of whiteness, that there is a way that you have to be checked as a people, and that we deserve the equal inalienable rights just as you deserve those inalienable rights, And so, he becomes controversial. He's followed by the FBI, and this is very important because they keep tabs on him. The FBI, the NYPD, New York Police Department, the CIA are all investigating or even infiltrating the Nation of Islam. And the president, or the head of the FBI, Edgar Hoover, is so concerned about Malcolm X that they want to create some kind of a rift between him and Elijah Muhammad, because they realize if Elijah Muhammad dies, then that means the one who would take his position after him would be none other than Malcolm X, and they didn't want to see that happening, so therefore they infiltrate them to try and create this rift. But Malcolm X himself, remember, of course, he's very literate, and something really interesting happens in the year 1962-63. Malcolm X comes to discover through Wallace Muhammad, the son of Elijah Muhammad, who then later on becomes a Sunni Muslim, by the way, after Elijah Muhammad's death. He's now an imam somewhere in America. He discovers from his son that his father, i.e. Elijah Muhammad, has fathered 6 illegitimate children of different girls, young girls, in the Nation of Islam. And he sees that as an affront, because he sees that, well, we're being taught, to live righteous lives of no pork and no smoking and no drugs and stay healthy and stay physically fit, and create good families and be truthful to your wife and everything else. And here we have our leader who is doing these things against these girls. And he really saw that as, well, this is something that's not sitting right with him. But then simultaneously, what happens during his time of investigation into his leader, who he loved so much and he really believed he was the prophet of God, comes the assassination of the President of America, John F. Kennedy. So when John F. Kennedy was assassinated, Elijah Muhammad gave an instruction to the Nation of Islam not to make any comments in the media, because he said everybody loved John F. Kennedy, so we should try and just let that incident pass. Malcolm X didn't make any comment. In fact, he gave a lecture where he spoke about the same things about black self-resistance and black suffering. But at the end of the lecture, he was interviewed by the press, and they asked him about what his thoughts are concerning the assassination of President John F. Kennedy. And Malcolm X gave these very famous words of that I never feel sad if my chickens leave, my farm, my barn, but they will always come back to my own farm to roost. And he said that the assassination of President John F. Kennedy is an example of the chickens coming home to roost, meaning he's saying that any evil and corruption you sow in other foreign countries is one day going to come back to strike you, right? And so what this statement does is that in the American media, they're really plastering everywhere that Malcolm X is joyful over the assassination of Martin Luther King, and this really upsets Elijah Muhammad because he says you've disobeyed the order of, we should just be silent in this incident, and this creates more of a rift now between the two people. And then he's suspended from speaking to the media for 90 days. Malcolm X used this time, during this time of where he's dubious about who this person Elijah Muhammad truly is, and the fact that he's suspended, so therefore gives him a bit of autonomy and freedom to go make his own investigations. And so during that time it was that he travels to the Middle East, travels to Egypt, travels to Africa, and also performs, travels to Makkah for the Hajj. And this then, when we think about Malcolm X, we think of him mostly in light of his conversion, to Sunni Islam, where he performs, I'll read the beautiful excerpts, from the book concerning what he says, what he noticed, what he witnessed from the Muslims, in Makkah when he performed the Hajj, and how it transformed his previous thoughts about racism and about the white people and everything else. But it was just important for us to understand the context that is informing the person, Malcolm Little, who becomes Malcolm X, who becomes Al-Hajj Malik al-Shabazz. And that is that there was 400 years of slavery. These people that we speak of, like even people who predated Malcolm X but became inspirational, in the Black Civil Rights Movement. People like, Harriet Tubman. By the way, Harriet Tubman, who was called the Moses of her people because she was called the conductor of the Underground Railway movement because she kept traveling, to the South, trying to free black people, take them to the safe area of Chicago. And she has this very famous line of we got to follow the Northern Star because Northern Star would take them to safety. Harriet Tubman's mother's name was Amnita. Many historians they suggest maybe her mother's name in fact was Amina when she first arrived into America. But due to forced conversion to Christianity, the name becomes changed to Amnita from Amina. That's Harriet Tubman. In that same time, there are other major events happening. Look at the 1950s. Emmett Till. Emmett Till was a young boy, 16 years old, who travels from Chicago, which was a safe area, down south, to Mississippi. This is a southern state. It was a dangerous area for black people. But his cousins lived in Mississippi. And Emmett Till tried to convince his mother to let him go to see his cousin, to stay there for a few days, and she said no because it's so dangerous. But then he convinced her, and then he goes down south and spends time with his cousins. And one day he's in a sweet shop with his cousins, and it says that he wolf whistled at a white woman, young white woman, and the white woman, she screams, when she sees him, and then she goes home and tells her husband that this is what this black boy has just done. That evening, the husband, together with the husband's friend, they go to the cabin where this young boy, Emmett Till, is staying with his cousins and the cousin's grandfather. They break the door down. They go to his bed. They drag him from his home. They take him to the Tallahatchie River in Mississippi, and they beat him so severely. After beating him so severely, they cut his body up. And then they strangle him, and then they shoot him dead, and they dump his body in the Mississippi River. the climax moment, one of the two climax moments for the civil rights movement was this murder of this innocent child, Emmett Till. And so now when they find his body in the river, the police they put the body in a box, in a wooden casket, and they seal it. And then they inform his mother, Maya Till, that this is what's happened to your son. But they say to Maya Till, the mother, that we request you not to open the casket, because he was so disfigured. He was so badly disfigured, on his face and his body. They said, don't open the casket. But she says, but I want to see what you did to my son. And she sees him, and then they said to her on the funeral, please have the funeral in a closed casket, so people don't have to see his face, his body. And she said that you did this to my son. I want the world to see what you did to my son. They said 1/3 of all people in that church on that day fainted when they saw his face. You can see it's just disgusting what they did to him. But it becomes really a watershed moment in the civil rights, because what it is it inspires people. One of the philosophies of Martin Luther King, by the way, Dr. Martin Luther King, was that Martin Luther King, he had all of these he had these things called sit-ins where you had segregation of blacks and whites, where blacks were not allowed to sit in white restaurants, but they would go and they simply sit in, called a sit-in. And then the shop owner or would ask them to leave, and then they would refuse, and then the police would come. They would spend time in prison, and these things kept happening. One of Martin Luther King's philosophy was the idea that white America is not at this stage prepared to recognize our suffering. It's called the media or the compassion fatigue. It's like if you see images on TV and you see them once and twice, then you feel like turning the channel because you don't want to face the fact that somebody else somewhere is suffering, or you don't want to feel a sense of responsibility. It's called diffused responsibility. You want to feel like, let other people deal with it. Why would I want to feel sad or sorry or responsible for that suffering? And so his philosophy was that people have to see black people suffering for them to even feel a sense of moral responsibility, as opposed to being bystanders, to end up ever becoming like having the feeling of wanting to rescue black people in their victimhood. And so in all of these attacks and vicious beatings, the idea was to let the world see the face of America. So the killing of Emmett Till becomes a very, very big moment in the civil rights struggle, because it meant a lot of white people are now exposed to seeing, well, this is the real face of brutality. In the same year, you have the beginning of the Montgomery bus boycott with Rosa Parks, an amazing young woman. Rosa Parks, the woman who stayed seated on the bus when the white man came in, and she had to give him space, because if the bus is full, right, and a white man comes in and there's a black person sitting on the front seat, that black person has to give that seat to the white person. This is how it was in America. And so she refused, and she's remained seated on the chair. Later on, she said, she was interviewed and asked, why didn't you get up? Why didn't you get up? And she said, well, some people, they think I didn't get up because I was too old. She says, I was in my early 40s. I wasn't very old. So that's not the reason. She says, some people, they think I wouldn't get up because I was tired after a hard day's work. She says, I wasn't any more tired than any other day of work. She said, the only reason I didn't get up because I was too tired of giving in. I was too tired of giving in, And so the whole movement of the bus boycott becomes a way of rallying black people in a very unified way, for a very important cause. And so these two events happening in the same year was quite an important thing. Malcolm X in this time, of course, is really rising in popularity, but then when he decides to leave the Nation of Islam and travels, it just shows an evolution of faith, an evolution of maturity in this one individual called Malcolm X. who's exposed to all of this brutality, but is trying to find ways of addressing that sense of injustice. Again, Malcolm X would say that I am for justice, whoever it's for or whoever it's against. I'm for justice. This is why Malcolm X is, when we think about, we don't think Malcolm X only in relation to black suffering. That's a very, very, probably the biggest part of his life. But Malcolm X, during his travels, also went to Palestine. He went to Gaza. He spent time in the Khan Yunus refugee camp in Gaza. He became the first African American to meet the PLO, the Palestinian Liberation Organization. He became the first African American to champion the rights of the Palestinians, and particularly from Gaza, right? So his outreach was really beyond just the suffering of black people in America, although that was his primary concern. We learned this great importance of remembering as Muslims that it's not always about just moral compassion, but it's about moral consistency. It's about moral consistency, meaning there are other people also suffering. And Allah made us ummatun ukhrijat linnas, and a nation Allah has taken out for mankind, right? To feel the suffering of others, to want to alleviate the suffering of others is part of our obligation. And so when he goes to Makkah, an amazing thing happens. And so what he says is this, and I'll read the words, his words, so you can clearly see, subhanAllah. He says that he was asked, they asked me, so now he goes for the Hajj. And he said, I only knew what I had left in America and how it contrasted with what I had found in the Muslim world. He said the color blindness of the Muslim world in its religious life and the color blindness of the Muslim world in its human life had the deepest impact on me in reversing my previous stereotypes. Look at that. Look at that, subhanAllah. This is why we should remember always that other people are seeing us. Not just about, this is the message of Muslims, what about the people of the streets? How do they see how we are behaving outside and inside this masjid? It's all about perceptions. Perceptions. Yesterday we had after Jummah khutbah, a young boy came inside the masjid called Nathan. He came inside the masjid, and I said, but he didn't hear the sermon. My khutbah was on Malcolm X yesterday because 21st was the anniversary of assassination, and I said, did you hear the sermon? And he said, no. I said, it was about Malcolm X, He goes, I said, yeah. I said, so it was about Malcolm X, then he became Muslim. He said, I always thought Malcolm X was always a Muslim. Then I began to explain to him about, no, Malcolm X, he was first Malcolm Little. But the point is, it was a sense of engagement, And this is what Malcolm X now is exposed to, engaging with the outer world. The outer, aside from your inner circles, we have inner circles and outer circles. Oftentimes, if we're simply entrenched in our inner circles, we don't become very cognizant of the fact there's an outer circle who are witnessing what's happening in our inner circle. That outer circle is extremely important because those are the people who are potentially going to become Muslims or learn about Islam. So he says, about 20 of us Muslims who had finished the Hajj were sitting in a huge tent on Mount Arafah. As a Muslim from America, I was the center of attention. They asked me what about the Hajj had impressed me the most. One of the several who spoke English asked, they translated my answers for the others. My answer to that question was not the one they expected, but it drove home my point. I said, the brotherhood. The people of all races, colors from all over the world coming together as one. It has proved to me the power of the one God. Allahu Akbar. It may have been out of taste, but that gave me an opportunity and I used it to preach them a quick little sermon on America's racism and its evils. Look how Allah has given us so many a cure, so many a solution, so many an answer to things still plaguing the world today. The reason why Malcolm X is still remembered and spoken of because the things he was addressing, what? Imperialism. He was addressing empire. He was addressing racism. He was addressing othering. He was addressing slavery. He was addressing discrimination. All the things that he was doing are still things prevalent in our world today. This is why the call and the concern of Malcolm X is still the concern of us today. You know, Malcolm X was someone who put that sense of moral responsibility and he connected it to moral compassion. And he put self-sacrifice over self-interest. You know, when he goes to Africa, he meets with all the African leaders. Can you imagine? Presidents. He says in his autobiography, he says that they made me sit, you know, where presidents sit. You know, and he says that they said to me, we are all offering you jobs. Heads of state offering him jobs. And they say that, you know, you stay here, we'll give you refuge. No need to go back to America. Malcolm X refused and he wanted to go back to America. I mean, that's the danger zone. That's the danger zone, you know. But that's where the struggle and the sacrifice was. And so when he's in the Hajj, therefore, he says these words, subhanAllah, he says that, never have I witnessed such sincere hospitality and the overwhelming spirit of true brotherhood as is practiced by people of all colors and races here in the ancient Holy Land, the home of Abraham, Muhammad, and all the prophets of the Holy Scriptures. Just imagine that for a second, you know, that sense of unity of purpose, unity of man. Allah in the Quran says, subhanahu wa ta'ala, Ya ayyuhan nas, inna khalaqnakum min dhakrin wa untha wa ja'alnakum shu'uban wa qaba'il ta'arafu, inna akramakum inda atqakum. Allah says, O people, we created you from a male and a female, and we made you into nations and tribes so you would recognize one another. It doesn't mean so you would harbor dissent and rivalries and hatred for one another. It means you would have a sense of common recognition that there are differences, and that's from the miracles of Allah. How do we know? Because Allah is saying, وَمِنْ آيَاتِهِ خَلْقُ السَّمَاوَاتِ وَالْأَرْضِ وَاخْتِلَافُ اللَّيْلِ وَاخْتِلَافُ أَلْسِنَتِكُمْ وَأَلْوَانِكُمْ. Allah says, and from the signs of Allah is the creation of the heavens and the earth, and the differences in your colors and differences in your tongues. Meaning you speak different languages and you look different with different complexions. This is why when Islam came, I mean, look at the freedom that Bilal found in Islam, radiallahu anhu. You know, when he heard, there's a man and he's saying that we're all equal, what impact it had on his heart. That simple call of defeat of racism. We shouldn't forget that. I mean, there are people in our streets, in our world, in our schools who feel othered. They feel different. You might have heard the story of that young 9-year-old boy, the dwarfish boy. Did you guys hear that in the news? You saw that. I mean, you don't think Islam has a solution? Of course Islam has a solution for that boy. And for all people who prejudice other people based upon a person's complexion. Because the Prophet told us, إِنَّ اللَّهَ لَا يَنْظُرُ إِلَىٰ أَجْسَامِكُمْ وَلَا إِلَىٰ صُوَرِكُمْ وَلَكِنْ يَنْظُرُ إِلَىٰ قُلُوبِكُمْ. Allah does not look at your forms, your images, your shapes. Allah looks at your hearts. There is something that is transcendental, above and beyond the outer form of a human being. But if the focus is always only on the outer form of a human being, you're not up to the standards of beauty, you're not up to the standards of correct height. Right? That means everyone's going to suffer then, because no one is able to be good enough for anybody else's standards. But Allah gave us a much higher standard of observance, you know, of living by that sense of standard, of you fulfill Allah's pleasure. You know, look at the example, Julaybib was in fact described like dwarfish, small, rajulun damim, quite not very nice in appearance. But look at the honor the Prophet gave him when Julaybib was martyred. And the Prophet says to his companion, هَلْ تَفْقِدُونَ مِنْ أَحَدٍ. Are you missing anybody? And they said, نعم, فُلان وَفُلان وَفُلان. We missed this, that person. The Prophet asked second time, are you missing anybody? They said, yes. This, that person. The Prophet asked the third time, are you missing anybody? They said, La, no. That's it. And what did the Prophet say? وَلَكِنِّي أَفْقِدُ جُلَيْبِيبَ. I miss Julaybib, go and find him. The Prophet's concern was concern with the one that people were not concerned about. Prophets were with those on the fringes of human society, on the margins of human society. We have to really take that to heart. There are people on the streets who nobody speaks to. Loneliness is an epidemic. Loneliness in this country is an epidemic. And it's a killer, because that's to do with your stress levels. You're lonely. You feel a sense of abandonment. There was a thing I watched, a woman who was in maybe 50, 60. She said, no, she was young. Sorry, she was younger. But she said that, I could go 3 months and nobody would speak to me. 3 months. And she said, I go out to the shops to do my shopping only for the purpose to speak to the cashier, because I have nobody else to speak to. And so as I'm putting my things in my bag, I'm speaking to cashier just so I can talk to another human being. I mean, you don't think Allah made us human beings? We have human needs, right? People can feel lonely. People have loss. People lose family members. How do you think they feel? Right? So this is about tapping into people's lives, that people have situations in life, And so Allah is therefore giving us these solutions that we're not to discriminate. Allah in the Quran says, Ya ayyuhalladhina amanu, la yaskhar qawmun min qawmin asa an yakunu khayran minhum. O people, you believe, one group of people should not make fun of another group of people. وَلَا نِسَاءٌ مِّن نِسَاءٍ عَسَىٰ أَن يَكُنَّ خَيْرًا مِّنْهُنَّ. And nor should a group of women make fun of another group of women. وَلَا تَلْمِزُوا أَنفُسَكُمْ وَلَا تَنَابُزُوا بِالْأَلْقَابِ. Nor should you defame and nor should you insult anybody else. Right? Because all of that is utterly superficial, because everything is judged by Allah in this life and in the next life about what the standard of human greatness is. It isn't based upon you don't look good enough, or you don't look handsome enough. All of these are superficial. Or you're not lighter enough, in your complexion. And so he says, I have been blessed to visit the holy city of Makkah. I have made my 7 circuits around the Kaaba, led by a young Mutawif named Muhammad. He goes on to say, there were tens of thousands of pilgrims from all over the world. They were of all colors, from blue-eyed blondes to black-skinned Africans. But we were all participating in the same ritual, displaying a spirit of unity and brotherhood that my experiences in America had led me to believe never could exist between the white and the non-white. What a solution for racism in Islam. Do you remember when Abu Dharr al-Ghifari radiallahu anh, when he says to Bilal, Ya ibn Sauda, they had an argument. He said, Ya ibn Sauda, O son of a black woman. By the way, Abu Dharr was extremely dark-skinned. This is the tragic irony in the whole thing. He was extremely dark-skinned. And he's saying to Bilal, O son of a black woman. That means his insult was not just to do with his skin, it was to do with his lineage. He's coming from Abyssinia, and you're not fully Arab. So it was more than just race. Although race is a social construct, yeah. But he says, and Bilal felt so insulted, and so he goes to the Prophet and he says, Ya Rasulullah, this is what Abu Dharr said to me. And the Prophet wasn't happy. He was upset with. And when Abu Dharr came later in the day to see the Prophet and the Prophet looked away from him, and Abu Dharr realized it must be that Bilal came here before to tell the Prophet what had just happened. And the Prophet says to Abu Dharr, did you say this to Bilal? And Abu Dharr said, yeah. And he said, إِنَّكَ مْرَأً فِيكَ جَاهِلِيَّةٌ. You're a man who still has ignorance in you. Like, that racism is pre-Islam. That's pre-Islamic. That isn't where we are. And so it's a very important occasion, important lesson learning for both Abu Dharr. And then there was this reconciliation. And so Abu Dharr says to Bilal, I want you to put your foot on my cheek. Put your foot on my cheek, and as a way of penance, as a way of atonement, as a way of me feeling humbled by you. And Bilal says, no, but your cheek is one that deserves to be kissed, not to have a person's foot on the cheek, but deserves to be kissed. This is the whole point of idfa' billati ahsan, repel evil with good. And Allah says, فَإِذَا الَّذِي بَيْنَكَ وَبَيْنَهُ عَدَاوَةٌ كَأَنَّهُ وَلِيٌّ حَمِيمٌ. It will be the one between you and him. There is enmity, you become as mutual friends. So Malcolm X has this amazing experience. He says, throughout my travels in the Muslim world, I've met, talked to, and have eaten with people who in America would have been considered white, But the white, this is the key thing, but the white attitude was removed from their minds by the religion of Islam. You see, but the white attitude had been removed from their minds by the religion of Islam. I've never before seen sincere and true brotherhood practiced by all colors together, irrespective of their color. Right? This is a very, very, very powerful moment in his life to see what he had never seen in America could ever happen, and he's seeing it being displayed by the Muslims, in the Hajj. Allahu Akbar. He says, we were truly all the same, brothers, because their belief in one God had removed the white from their minds, the white from their behavior, and the white from their attitude. Didn't our Prophet say, Allah, on Hajj, the Prophet said, Allah la faddun li Arabi ala ajami, wala li ajami ala Arabi, wala li ahmar ala aswad, wala li aswad ala ahmar, illa bit taqwa. He says, there is no virtue of an Arab over a non-Arab, or a non-Arab over an Arab, or a black over a white, or a white over a black, except by the scale and the standard of taqwa, of a person's closeness to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. He says, Ya son of Adam, kullukum min Adam wa Adam min turab. All of you are from Adam, and Adam was from dust. Right? That you're all one and the same, and that equal. You're just all humans. At your basic level, you're just all human beings, and you grow from that point onwards. So Malcolm X, therefore, has this. He says, never have I been so highly honored, never have I been made to feel more humble and unworthy. Who would believe the blessings that have been heaped upon an American Negro? A few nights ago, a man. So this is really groundbreaking for him as a man who has now made this transition away from the nation of Islam and the racism, because that's also black supremacy. That's black supremacism, to teach that white people are devils and there's no good in white people. And blacks are the supreme race. They even say, when A'udhu Billah, that God himself is black. So they have all of these beliefs coming in, to challenge white supremacy, but it in turn becomes black supremacy. And he sees the way that's kind of, neutralized, in Islam in its true essence. Malcolm X, when he returns back to America, he sets up two organizations. One's called the Muslim Mosque Incorporated, and he says in his own autobiography that this was I wanted to make it a way for teaching people about Islam. I mean, he's giving da'wah, calling others to Allah, calling others to the trueness of Islam in Muslim Mosque Incorporated. So I want to make it a way for people to learn about Islam. Another one called African American Unity of African American Organizations, and this is a way for having more of an inclusion, of spirit between other African American leaders. And there's something that you might not know. There is a very, very powerful thing. In 1964, 64. Martin Luther King. So you probably think that they're kind of always at odds, Martin and Malcolm, and one's all about non-violent resistance, and the other one could advocate violent resistance if the needs are there for that. 1964, Malcolm X sends a telegram to Martin Luther King because the KKK, the Ku Klux Klan, was planning to disturb a rally that Martin Luther King was holding, I think in Alabama. And so he sends this dispatch to him, telegram, you could even read it also online. And he sends a telegram to him, and in the telegram he says that, just to let you know that we also have brothers, who can be there for you. You just give the word, and we'll bring our brothers to help you, to help protect your lives, at the rally. And then he sends on the same occasion a telegram to the leader of the KKK, and he says, just to let you know, if any of you are thinking of disturbing the procession of Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, you'll be met by such force, from us. And he ends his letter by saying, with a dot ellipsis, and it says, by any means necessary. Just shows, this single point, where both Malcolm X and Martin Luther King, their paths, they meet like that. And that was more representative of a spirit of inclusivity, of a spirit of understanding between both of them, both working in their own ways, really for the similar or same kind of cause. But it just shows how Malcolm X is now evolving, because even his mindset about the solution, he said, I'll work with anybody, white person, black person, as long as you understand, the gravity of the circumstance facing my people, I'll work with you. And there were, of course, many white people who were also advocates for ending of abuse and mistreatment and racism towards black people. And so Malcolm X causes such a situation in the nation of Islam because he's beginning to openly declare in media that Elijah Muhammad is not the man he claims to be, that this man is a fraud, he's a hypocrite, he can't be the prophet of God and everything else. And the nation of Islam, on that day, on February 21st, 1965, there is a very good TV series, maybe you've seen on Netflix, called Who Killed Malcolm X? And the brother who produced it, Abdurrahman, who is a revert brother, spends 20 years trying to find out who really killed Malcolm X. And he interviews people, who were there at the time with Malcolm X, Nation of Islam, who are now elderly men. Some of them have died, to get down to the real facts about who really killed Malcolm X and who was involved. The reality is that there was surveillance on all quarters. Malcolm X's inner core, there was 9, informants in his inner core. 9 informants. The people on the day in the Audubon ballroom, there were NYPD informants there, FBI informants there. Nation of Islam was completely infiltrated. In Elijah Muhammad's inner core, there was infiltrators, right? And so there is so much likelihood that whatever did happen that day, it happened with the knowledge of other parties outside of the Nation of Islam. There were people who pulled the triggers were members of the Nation of Islam. They were members of the Nation of Islam. But the fact that there was no real police presence on that day, the fact that all the other speakers cancelled on that day, Malcolm X, by the way, he knew his time. He even said, I believe I'm living on borrowed time now. I'm living on borrowed time. He says, every new day for me is a day where I believe it's just another borrowed day. Because he knew that the situation was so intense between him and the Nation of Islam, it was very likely, he says, that if all it would take is for the leader, Mr. Muhammad, to give a signal, and one of them would respond because they think they're doing it in the name of Allah, in the name of God. And so this would happen, and so it was on February 21st, he goes to deliver his speech, as you've probably seen the things from the Denzel Washington movie, Malcolm X, or seen the pictures where he stands to deliver his speech. One of the things that I think it was Imam Siraj Wahad says that on that day, the person who was introducing him is usually the person that sits next to him, on the stage. And on that day, Malcolm X, he said, I don't want you sitting next to me, I want you sitting at the back of the ballroom, And maybe this is an indication that he believed that maybe that was the day that he would be shown. And Allah knows best, of course. But then as he stands up to deliver his speech, and he greets the audience and saying, Assalamu alaikum, 2 people, get up and they make like a smoke bomb and they shout some words, and then they come to the front of the stage and they fire bullets into him, more than 20 bullets, into the body of Malcolm X. And so we hope and pray that our brother Al-Hajj Malik Shabazz died a martyr's death, as someone who was propagating Islam and true Islam, in a time of real deeply entrenched hostilities, not only from the whites but also from, his former allies in the Nation of Islam. It's really interesting if you think about the life of Malcolm X, Al-Hajj Malik Shabazz, because, like I said, in our quite contemporary time, to think of a person who really lived by principles of courage and bravery and resistance. There is so much for us as Muslims to think about, in light of the kind of concerns that Malcolm X had. Like I said, in speaking truth to power. The Prophet said, "Afdalul jihad, kalimatu haqqin in the sultan." The best jihad is to speak the truth in the face of the tyrant ruler. And Malcolm X really he did that. Malcolm X was someone who believed that the plight and suffering of other people is much bigger than your own life, much bigger, transcends that. If you learn to put, compassion over greed. In fact, look at this. Once he was asked about, he was asked in an interview. This is just before. This is in the January, I think, when he was. This was, I think, in the January or the February. Yeah, this is January. So this is 1 month before his assassination. He was asked, "What do you think is responsible for race prejudice in the U.S.?" And Malcolm X says, "Ignorance and greed." Imagine that as an answer: ignorance and greed. He says, "and a skillfully designed program of miseducation that goes right along with the American system of exploitation and oppression." What a remarkable answer, ignorance and greed, right? It reminds you of, what you have in the Christmas Carol, Charles Dickens play, when you have ignorance and want. If anybody was studied that in school, ignorance, he says, beware of these two, ignorance and want. You see, people are ignorant and people are greedy. People are ignorant, they have no sense of education, they won't simply know, like juhal, ignorant people. And greed, if you're greedy, you're self-consumed, you have no space, you have no time to worry about anybody else's suffering, anybody else's cry, anybody else's plight, And I think his words are quite exact in that sense. A lot for us to take lessons from. May Allah make us all active in our communities. May Allah make us brave. May Allah make us of those who have a spirit of courage and resistance against hostilities and against injustice. May Allah make us of those who are truly and deeply concerned about alleviating the suffering of all people and against all injustice. May Allah forgive and accept from all of us. May Allah have mercy on our brother Al-Hajj Malik Shabazz, and may Allah allow us to take an inspiration from that. In recounting the life of someone like Al-Hajj Malik Shabazz, there is so many good things that we could take lessons from. But it should be said, and this is important for us to always say, that anybody who has been moved, inspired, motivated by Islam is not even a fraction, not even the tiniest drop in comparison to the greatness of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Or any quality of bravery of the Prophet was described as ajwad an-nas wa ashja' an-nas, as the most generous person and the bravest person. All right, and all of these qualities are simply taking something, from the character of our Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And he, of course, is uswatun hasana, the one that Allah commanded us to follow and commanded us to obey and to emulate. Everybody else has good things and also has bad things, including, of course, our brother Malcolm X, Al-Hajj Malik Shabazz. But we do admire the fact that a human story of somebody who transitions and evolves and became who he became, and a great kind of a hero in that sense, for Islam and Muslims, and for us to teach our children about. I think it's very commendable. May Allah accept from all of us. Jazakumullah khairan. Food? Yeah. Oh, okay. There is food prepared for everyone. Jazakallah khair.